On a rainy autumn evening, Danielle checked into the Lakeview Hotel, a grand but faded establishment hidden deep in the mountains. The hotel had once been a prized destination, famous for its beautiful view of Lake Morrow, but time had worn it down. The outside lights flickered against the dense fog that rolled off the lake, and its dark windows seemed like sunken eyes. Um, Danielle was here on a solo weekend getaway, looking for a place where she could disconnect and relax. At the front desk, the night clerk, a man with unsettlingly pale skin and heavy-lidded eyes, handed her the key to room 3114. His smile was so slight that she almost wondered if she imagined it. "Enjoy your stay," he murmured, his voice low and clipped. As she ascended in the rickety elevator, Danielle noticed the silence. It was as if the walls were thick enough to drown out the outside world, trapping her in a cocoon of stillness. When she finally reached her room, she hesitated. Room 3114 looked older and more worn than the others she had passed, but it was too late to go back down, so she unlocked the door and entered. The room smelled faintly of mildew, and the decor seemed frozen in the 1970s, with faded floral wallpaper and a bedspread with a dull pattern of brown and green. She turned on the lights, but the dim bulbs offered little comfort. Closing the door, Danielle set her things down and lay on the bed, scrolling idly on her phone until she dozed off. In the middle of the night, Danielle woke up suddenly. She didn't know what had disturbed her, but she felt a chill in the room. Her eyes adjusted to the darkness, and she noticed a strange shape in the corner near the window, a shadow, unnaturally still and too thick to be cast by anything in the room. Her heart raced, but she tried to shake it off, telling herself it was her imagination. Then she heard a faint rustling. It sounded like someone shuffling across the carpet, each step slow and deliberate. Danielle froze, unable to look away from the corner, and reached for her phone on the nightstand to check the time. The screen glared in the darkness. 3:14 a.m. Her heart thumped harder. As if in response, the shadow moved, gliding closer to the bed. The shape began to materialize into something grotesque. A figure hunched over, with twisted limbs and hollow eyes that seemed to absorb all the light. She wanted to scream, but couldn't muster a sound. Instead, she squeezed her eyes shut, praying it would disappear when she opened them again. After a few seconds, the silence returned, and Danielle dared to peek. The shadow was gone. With trembling hands, she switched on the bedside lamp, flooding the room in dim yellow light. She felt foolish, almost laughing at her own terror, but a lingering sense of dread made it hard to relax. She decided to leave the light on and try to fall back asleep, rationalizing that it was nothing but a nightmare. The following morning, she made her way to the lobby, hoping to see some other guests and shake off the eerie feeling. But to her surprise, the lobby was empty, except for the night clerk, who was still at the desk, though he looked exactly as he had the night before. Same pale face, same slight smile. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, his tone somehow both polite and mocking. "Not really," Danielle admitted. I thought I saw someone in my room, probably just my imagination." The clerk's expression didn't change. "Lakeview can play tricks on you," he said, almost as if rehearsing the line. "Sometimes the past has a way of lingering here." Danielle nodded, brushing it off as just another spooky anecdote from a hotel employee. After grabbing a quick breakfast, she decided to spend her day exploring the lake. The fog had cleared, and the sun had risen enough to give the area a ghostly, serene beauty. By the time she returned, she had convinced herself that whatever she'd seen or thought she'd seen was a one-off experience. That night, however, as she lay in bed, she felt the same heavy chill settle over her. Once again, she woke up at exactly 3:14 a.m., and her heart sank as she saw the shadow return, this time closer, its dark, hollow eyes staring straight at her. The figure seemed more distinct now, almost familiar, as if it were somehow connected to her. Her breathing quickened as she backed up against the headboard. Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure tilted its head, and for a brief moment, Danielle thought she saw herself in its eyes, an image of herself, lying in bed, alone and terrified. Then a faint, croaky voice echoed in the room, chilling her to the core. "You're in my room." She bolted upright, flipping on the light, but the shadow had vanished once more. Shaking, she decided she couldn't stay another night. She packed her bags in a hurry and went down to the lobby, intending to check out early. The night clerk was still there, watching her with that same unsettling gaze. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, his tone strangely flat. "Yes, I can't stay here another night." He shrugged, as if used to it. "As you wish." She hurriedly signed the paperwork and made her way to her car, relief washing over her as she left the hotel behind. As she reached the main road, Danielle glanced back, feeling oddly compelled to take one last look. But what she saw froze her to the spot. The Lakeview Hotel was dark, silent, and abandoned. Every window was shattered, the walls covered in graffiti and ivy. The roof sagged, and parts of it had collapsed, exposing the hollow interior to the elements. It looked as though no one had stepped foot inside in decades. Her mind raced as she tried to process what she was seeing. She fumbled for her phone, searching frantically for Lakeview Hotel's information. The search results were sparse, but finally she found a newspaper article dated 20 years ago. Lakeview Hotel closes permanently after tragic accident claims young woman's life. The article recounted the tragic story of Danielle Carter, a young woman found dead in room 14 under mysterious circumstances. Since then, the hotel had been abandoned, its doors forever shut. Danielle felt her breath catch as she read her own name. A cold dread filled her as she glanced back toward the ruins, catching one final glimpse of her own figure reflected in the shattered windows. In that fleeting moment, she understood. She had never left the Lakeview Hotel. On a late winter evening, Mason and his girlfriend Lily arrived at the Elmswood Inn, an isolated, old-fashioned hotel buried deep in the woods. They'd driven hours through an endless, twisting road to reach it, the GPS constantly losing signal and the fog so thick it seemed to swallow their headlights. They were on a winter getaway, planning to hike the nearby trails and escape from city life for a few days. But now, under the cold, looming shadow of the inn, Lily felt a chill that had nothing to do with the icy wind. The lobby was eerily empty, with only a single desk lamp casting a pale yellow light over the thick, dusty air. The clerk, a wiry man with a thin, stretched face and sunken eyes, handed them a key to room 405. He didn't say much, only a brief, "Enjoy your stay," in a tone that seemed more a warning than a wish. As they walked down the narrow, dimly lit corridor to their room, Lily couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them. She glanced back a few times, convinced she'd heard faint footsteps behind them, but the hallway was empty each time. Room 405 was decorated in faded Victorian style, with creaky wooden furniture and floral wallpaper curling at the edges. An old, dusty mirror hung on the wall, its frame thick with cobwebs. They unpacked and settled in, but a strange unease lingered in the room. There was a faint, almost metallic smell that Lily couldn't place, and the air felt unnaturally heavy. Night fell quickly, bringing with it a biting cold. They huddled together in bed, Lily drifting into a restless sleep. Just as she began to dream, a noise pulled her back to consciousness, a faint scratching. She lay still, listening, heart pounding as the sound grew louder. It was coming from the other side of the wall, where the headboard was. She nudged Mason awake, whispering, "Do you hear that?" He groggily listened, and the scratching sound stopped abruptly. "You're imagining it," he muttered, rolling over. But Lily wasn't convinced. The next night, the same scratching returned, louder this time. She tried to ignore it, pressing her pillow over her ears. Finally, exhausted and annoyed, Mason got up and knocked on the wall. The scratching ceased. Satisfied, he climbed back into bed, but as soon as he lay down, there was a soft, slow knock on their door. They both sat up, exchanging nervous glances. "Maybe it's the clerk," Mason suggested, trying to sound calm. But when he opened the door, the hallway was empty. The lights flickered, and the distant hum of the heating system filled the silence. Mason closed the door, locking it this time. They lay awake, tense, listening as the scratching on the wall started again, more frantic and erratic. It sounded like claws raking across wood, each scrape sending a shiver down their spines. Just as Lily thought she couldn't take it any longer, the sound stopped, replaced by an even more chilling noise, a whisper. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Help me, please, help me." Mason jumped out of bed, breathing heavily. "This has to be some kind of prank," he said, his voice tight. "I'll go to the lobby and get some answers." But when he opened the door, he froze. At the end of the hall stood a figure, a woman with long, stringy black hair covering her face. Her clothes were torn and blood-stained, her skin pale as if drained of all life. She stood motionless, head tilted to one side, staring at them with eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light. Mason backed into the room, locking the door and pressing himself against it. "There's someone out there," he whispered, his face ashen. Lily gripped his arm, feeling panic rise as they listened to heavy, dragging footsteps outside their door. The knob jiggled, then rattled as if someone was trying to open it. Mason held his breath, hand pressed against the door, willing it to hold. After a few minutes, the sounds stopped, and silence returned. They stayed up the rest of the night, too terrified to move. At dawn, they packed quickly, deciding they couldn't stay another night. As they left the room, they noticed something strange. Just outside their door, scratched into the wood in jagged, messy letters, were the words, "Don't leave me here." Downstairs, the lobby was still empty, the desk clerk nowhere to be seen. Mason approached the front desk and rang the bell, but no one came. Frustrated, he glanced over the counter and spotted a dusty old guest book lying open. He flipped through it, pausing when he reached a yellowed page near the middle. There, under room 405, was a name, Lily Whitmore. The date was marked 20 years ago to the day. Lily's face turned pale as she stared at the page. That's my name," she whispered, backing away. Just then, a shadow passed behind them, reflected in the lobby mirror. Mason turned, expecting to see the clerk, but the room was empty. Yet in the reflection, they both saw it. A woman with stringy black hair and hollow eyes, standing just behind them, her mouth moving silently as if mouthing words they couldn't hear. Without another word, they ran out of the hotel, like throwing open the doors and stumbling into the cold morning light. They drove back to the city without stopping. The image of the woman burned into their minds. Later that day, when Mason went online to find information about the hotel, he stumbled upon a series of news articles from years ago. They detailed a string of disappearances at the Elmswood Inn. Each victim had checked into room 405. Each had left one last message in the guest book, scratched into the wood or scrawled in their own handwriting. And each victim had the same familiar face, Lily's face. The last line of the most recent article echoed in Mason's mind as he turned off his computer in terror. Authorities believe the ghost of room 405 is searching for someone, a woman with dark hair and a familiar name. Each year she appears, longing to find the one who abandoned her and bring her back, to stay forever. It was nearly midnight when Ethan finally arrived at the Briarwood Manor, a hulking, abandoned hotel on the edge of town. It was an infamous landmark with a reputation for paranormal activity, and Ethan was here for one reason alone, to prove that ghosts weren't real. He was a skeptic, running a popular online channel that debunked haunted locations. Briarwood, with its ominous history, would make for the perfect episode. Armed with a flashlight, a camera, and a microphone, he stepped through the creaking front doors. Dust coated every surface, and the air smelled of decay and something else. Something sweet, but rancid, like rotting fruit. The entryway was cavernous, with a grand staircase splitting into two wings. Briarwood had once been a prestigious hotel, but after a string of deaths in the 1950s, it had been shut down and left to decay. Ethan started recording his introduction in the lobby, panning his camera around the darkened room. As he described the hotel's notorious history, he thought he heard a faint rustling, like the sound of someone shuffling across the floor. He paused, holding his breath, but the noise stopped. Smirking, he spoke into the camera. "See? Just the building settling." He continued his exploration, moving toward the ballroom. His footsteps echoed off the cracked marble, and every now and then he'd catch a flicker of movement from the corner of his eye, a shadow slipping around a corner, or a fleeting glimpse of a figure on the stairs. He brushed it off as his imagination, knowing the mind had a way of filling empty spaces with something familiar, even if that something wasn't there. The ballroom was vast and hauntingly beautiful, with tarnished chandeliers hanging like skeletons from the ceiling. He set up his camera on a tripod and began his recording, challenging any spirits present to make themselves known. He felt silly, taunting what he knew was an empty room, but it was all part of the act. A few minutes passed in silence, the room heavy and oppressive. Just as he was about to pack up, he noticed something strange on the camera's screen. A faint outline in the corner of the ballroom. Squinting, he adjusted the focus, thinking it was a trick of the light. But the figure became sharper, a tall, thin shape with long, dark hair hanging over its face. It was just standing there, watching him. Ethan's mouth went dry. "Who's there?" he called, turning to face the corner. But when he looked up from the camera, the figure was gone. He chuckled nervously, telling himself it was a glitch or an optical illusion, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Suddenly, a low, murmuring voice echoed through the room, so faint it was almost impossible to make out. He spun around, trying to find the source, but the room was empty. Every direction he turned, the voice seemed to shift, slipping just out of reach. "All right, very funny," he muttered, though he was starting to feel uneasy. He turned off his camera and made his way back to the lobby, deciding he'd gotten enough footage for the night. As he reached the grand staircase, he heard the voice again, louder this time. A whisper that sent chills crawling up his spine. It was calling his name. "Ethan?" He stopped dead, every hair on his body standing on end. No one knew he was here. He hadn't told a soul. He turned slowly, his flashlight beam sweeping over the shadows, and then he saw it, a pale figure standing halfway up the staircase. It was a woman, her clothes tattered and stained, her eyes hollow and dark as pits. She seemed to sway slightly, her gaze fixed on him with a terrifying intensity. "Ethan," she whispered again, her voice carrying an edge of sorrow, of longing. He backed away, gripping his flashlight so tightly his hand shook. This isn't real. You're not real." But the woman took a step toward him, her movements slow, deliberate. "I've been waiting," she whispered. You're the last." He stumbled back, his heart pounding as he turned and bolted down a dark hallway. He didn't know where he was going, he just knew he had to get away from her. The hall twisted and turned, and he ran blindly, his footsteps echoing down the empty corridor. The flashlight began to flicker, casting the walls in sickly flashes of light. Suddenly, he found himself in front of a door, room 717, according to the tarnished brass plaque. Desperate, he threw the door open and slipped inside, shutting it behind him and leaning against it to catch his breath. The room was cold, far colder than the rest of the hotel. A thin layer of frost covered the floor, crunching under his shoes as he stepped further inside. He shined his flashlight around and saw a massive four-poster bed draped with decaying velvet curtains, a dusty armchair, and an old mirror on the wall. Ethan froze as he saw his reflection. At first, he thought the mirror was cracked, but as he looked closer, he realized it wasn't the glass. In the mirror, standing right behind him, was the same woman from the stairs. Her face was closer now, her hollow eyes staring straight into his, and a smile stretched across her face, wide and unnatural. Slowly, she raised a hand and placed it on his shoulder. Though he knew she wasn't physically there, he could feel the icy pressure like fingers digging into his skin. Panicked, he lunged for the door, only to find it locked. He pounded on it, yelling for help, but his voice seemed to vanish into the walls. He turned back to the mirror, trembling, only to find the woman had vanished. But something else had changed. In the mirror's reflection, he no longer saw himself alone in the room. There was someone lying on the bed, a man, sprawled out as if asleep, but his face was pale, his skin tinged with blue. Ethan stepped closer, his heart hammering, and realized with a sickening jolt that he was looking at himself. He staggered back, his mind reeling. "No, this can't be." Then he heard it again, the woman's voice, soft, soothing. "You're home now, Ethan," she whispered. "We've been waiting for you to join us." The room began to spin, his vision blurring as a crushing weight pressed down on him. Darkness crept into the edges of his vision, swallowing everything until he was left with only the faint sound of her voice, calling him over and over. The next morning, police officers arrived at Briarwood Manor, responding to an anonymous tip about strange noises coming from the building. They searched every room, finding nothing but dust and decay. Finally, they reached room 717, where they discovered a man lying motionless on the bed, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror. The frost in the room had melted, leaving only a faint, misty imprint on the floor. The officers searched his belongings and found a camera. As they scrolled through the footage, they noticed something strange. A woman standing in the background of every shot, her dark eyes fixed on the man in the videos. But the footage showed something else, too. In the very last frame, just before the screen went black, the man's face was visible, reflected in the cracked mirror. And standing behind him, her hands resting on his shoulders, was the woman in the tattered dress, smiling a wide, unnatural smile. Lauren had heard the rumors about the Ashcroft Hotel, an old, run-down building on the edge of town that had been closed for years. The stories varied, but one detail always came up. Anyone who stayed overnight in room 616 never made it out. Lauren didn't believe in the supernatural, but she was fascinated by urban legends, and her curiosity often got the better of her. Armed with a flashlight, a notebook, and her phone, she decided to spend the night at the Ashcroft to see if there was any truth to the tales. The lobby was a picture of decay, peeling wallpaper, cobwebs hanging from the chandeliers, and a layer of dust so thick that every step she took left a clear print. She shined her flashlight around, illuminating faded paintings and cracked, yellowed photographs on the walls. At the far end of the room stood an old-fashioned elevator, its doors slightly ajar. Lauren pressed the button for the 6th floor, and the elevator jerked to life with a grinding sound. The ascent was slow, each floor number lighting up one by one, casting an eerie glow in the dim space. Finally, the elevator stopped at the 6th floor with a shudder. The doors creaked open, revealing a long, dark hallway. Her heart quickened as she stepped out. Room 6116 was at the very end, the door slightly ajar as if waiting for her. She hesitated, feeling a strange pull to turn back, but she pushed the feeling aside. She'd come this far. The room was dark and cold, with a damp smell hanging in the air. She set her things down and shined her flashlight around. The furniture was old and broken, with springs poking through the mattress and a large, cracked mirror hanging above the dresser. She walked over to the window, looking out at the quiet street below, and pulled out her notebook to start documenting her experience. Just as she started writing, she heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails drumming on wood. She froze, listening as the sound grew louder, seeming to come from inside the room. She swept her flashlight across the room, but nothing was there. The tapping stopped, leaving her in silence again. She shrugged it off as nerves, forcing herself to keep writing. A few minutes later, the tapping resumed, louder this time. It sounded like it was coming from the closet. She stared at the door, trying to convince herself it was nothing, just an old building settling, but the sound wouldn't stop. Gathering her courage, she walked to the closet door and yanked it open. Inside, the small space was empty, just bare walls and a single rusty hanger. She laughed at herself, feeling silly, and closed the door. Then, as she turned away, the tapping started again, louder and more insistent. It wasn't coming from the closet this time, it was coming from the mirror. Lauren felt her blood turn to ice. The mirror's cracked surface seemed to warp and shift, shadows moving within it like something trapped behind the glass. She stepped closer, trying to make sense of the strange shapes, but then she realized it wasn't her own reflection looking back. A figure stood just behind her in the mirror's reflection. She could see it clearly now. A woman with long, tangled hair, her face hidden in shadow, staring directly at her with hollow eyes. Lauren spun around, but there was no one there. She looked back at the mirror, heart pounding. The woman was still there, but now she was moving closer, her hand reaching out as if trying to break through the glass. Lauren stumbled back, her breath shallow and quick, feeling a cold, heavy presence settle over the room. The woman's mouth began to move, her lips forming words that Lauren couldn't hear. She watched in horrified fascination as the woman's face twisted into a terrible expression of anger and pain. Finally, Lauren could make out the faintest whisper, like a breeze slipping through a crack in the wall. "Help me." The woman's hand pressed harder against the glass, and a spiderweb of cracks began to form, spreading across the mirror like a sickness. Lauren backed away, too terrified to look away but desperate to escape. Just as she reached the door, the mirror shattered with a deafening crash, spraying shards of glass across the room. Lauren flung the door open, running down the hallway toward the elevator. But as she reached the end of the hall, she saw something that made her stop in her tracks. There, at the other end, stood the woman, her hollow eyes fixed on Lauren, her mouth stretching into a wide, unnatural grin. Lauren turned and bolted down the stairs, her footsteps echoing through the empty hotel. She didn't stop until she reached the lobby, her breath ragged as she burst out the front doors and into the cold night air. She ran to her car, fumbling with her keys, and drove away as fast as she could, glancing in the rearview mirror every few seconds to make sure the woman wasn't following her. When she got home, she locked every door and window, trying to shake the feeling of dread that clung to her. She tried to sleep, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw that woman's face twisted and angry, staring at her. The next day, she decided to go back to the Ashcroft Hotel with a friend, desperate to prove to herself that it was all in her head. When they arrived, they found the building boarded up, with police tape across the entrance. A uniformed officer was standing by the door, and she approached him, hoping to ask a few questions. Before she could say anything, the officer looked her up and down, his expression turning to one of confusion. "How did you get in there last night?" he asked. I just walked in," Lauren replied, her voice shaking. The doors were open. The officer shook his head. "Impossible. The Ashcroft has been locked up for years. No one's been allowed inside since the incident in room 616. Lauren felt her stomach drop. "What incident?" The officer's gaze softened as he explained. "There was a woman who checked in a few years ago, alone, and no one ever saw her check out. They found her a week later in room 616, dead. She'd been trying to claw her way out of the closet. They say her spirit's still there, trying to reach anyone who comes close to her room." As the officer spoke, Lauren felt a cold chill wrap around her, and she instinctively glanced at her reflection in the hotel's dark window. And there, staring back at her from behind her own reflection, was the woman, her face twisted in that same terrible grin.